Good evening, dear viewers and listeners. I've got a special guest today, and before she's talking who she is, I have to share a joke with her because I've been pummeled on Twitter when I shared the news that I'm talking to my guest today. As my guest knows, I'm from Germany, currently residing in Brandenburg, and my federal government is formed between three parties: the Greens, Bündnis 90 Die Grüne, the Liberals, FDP, and the Social Democrats, SPD. And the SPD has this interior minister called Nancy Fraser. But my guest is called Nancy Fraser. Right. So everyone was joking that this more conservative social democrat Nancy Fraser would be writing a book that's critical of capitalism. But my guest, to make it crystal clear, is not part of the German government. Or are you?
No, definitely not. That's very funny.
Yeah, I found it funny too. So then tell my viewers and my listeners who you are.
Well, I am Nancy Fraser with an FR, and I'm in New York now, where I am a professor at the New School for Social Research. And I think of myself in the tradition of critical theory, and have for a long time done a fair amount of writing, scholarly writing, but also a little bit of public writing as well on things like feminism, social justice, racism, and lately I've been writing a lot about capitalism.
Yeah, that's good. And before we come to your newest book about capitalism, you are not a party member at all.
No, no. And in the United States, the only parties are the Democrats and the Republicans, and no, I'm not.
If you would join a party, which party would that be?
You mean in the German system? Oh, I
maybe the American system would be changing in the future. I don't know. Maybe.
Well,
which party would you join?
I was a very strong supporter of Bernie Sanders as representing the sort of best of the left wing of the Democratic Party. But that group is rather weak within the party, and I don't think there's much chance in the near future of them, becoming the dominant faction. And failing that, I just support those democratic socialists that occasionally run for office and win.
Okay, then let's talk about your book, which is called Cannibal Capitalism in English and was already published in the US. I've got your German version yesterday on International Women's Day, so thanks to the publisher. Wow. And in German, it's called Der Allesfresser, more like the omnivore.
Right. Right.
And
I haven't gotten a copy yet, so you're ahead of me of the German.
That's great. But I have a picture for you of the book. Okay. We will be talking about the cover.
Okay.
Soon.
Okay.
But I wanted to finish it. It was published by Suhrkamp. Herzlichen Dank an Suhrkamp. Thanks to Suhrkamp. So I have those problems.
Yeah. Now here it is. Wow. What is that?
Okay. So I have the first picture, Nancy Fraser, Der Allesfresser, with Ouroboros. I think of that. It's really, it looks really good in German.
I'm glad.
But I got criticism as well because of the picture of Ouroboros, who's here symbolized by a snake biting its tail. Mm-hmm. Ouroboros in the alchemically understanding is a symbol of perfection, which expresses the change and renewal of matter that takes place eternally mm-hmm. in the same processes. In this way, it's not exactly that what you talk about in your book, which means extinction of our whole system. So Ouroboros is eating, cannibalizing itself and everything it comes across. But in other ways, it's understood as a symbol of perfection. So how can you explain this?
Well, first of all, I think that you don't have, by any chance, a copy of the Verso edition, do you, in English?
No. I don't have the English.
I'm going to right now see if I can get you.
But I've seen a picture in the chat of the English version.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think the English version, in a sense, is better because it images the Ouroboros as a sort of chain of different snakes, each one eating the head or tail of the one in front of it, and it's all done in a kind of gold leaf, so that it looks like a currency symbol. It looks like the sign for the pound or the euro or something like that. So it brings in the sort of financial motif, which is not shown on the German cover. And I agree that the Suhrkamp cover does look a little bit too much like the perfect circle, the symbol of eternity, and so on. So in a sense, it's not as successful a cover. But the idea, as you say, is that of a self-destabilizing system, a system that consumes its own conditions of possibility and therefore is prone to crisis, to it's an internally contradictory system. It's consuming its own bases of existence. And the problem, of course, is that those bases of existence are also our bases of existence, consuming the nature that we need, consuming the energies for care work that we need, the public goods and public capacities to solve problems that we need, and so on and so forth. So it's a hugely dangerous system. That's the idea that the title in the English, Cannibal Capitalism, is meant to convey.
I've sent you a second picture as well. Maybe this would have been better for German or European audiences. That's symbolizing Uranus eating his children. I don't know if you are if you know Greek mythology.
Yes,
but that's maybe the same. Eating everything that's possible for your future. In this case, your children. And taking away the basis for future development.
You know, this is a very small and dark image that I can't see as clearly as I would like.
I'm sorry.
But no, that's okay. But I don't know who made this image. And I would have some concerns about it I wouldn't want that on my cover. But
it's pretty gruesome. I have to agree.
Well, it's not just that. It seems like there's a very dark man eating a blonde woman or something. It's a lot of imagery that I wouldn't
It's a
use.
Picture of Uranus eating his children. So.
No, I understand, but the depiction matters.
Yeah.
Anyway, I say,
you wouldn't agree.
I can see it better.
That's okay. So let's talk about your book. As you write about it, capital is currently cannibalizing every sphere of life, guzzling wealth from nature and racializing populations, sucking up our ability to care for each other and gutting the practice of politics. What's capitalism to you?
Okay, what lies behind this idea of cannibal capitalism is what I call an expanded view of what capitalism is. Too often we think of capitalism as an economic system in which we have, wage labor in factories producing commodities that are sold on the market, and then there's a credit system, an international financial order, and so on. In other words, it's the sphere of life that is very directly monetized. Now, that's the, as I say, the usual definition, but it's too narrow if for our purposes today. Today, we need to understand why the social system and how the social system that we're living in is precipitating a very severe and urgent ecological crisis, why it is precipitating very acute crises of democracy in states throughout the world, why it is precipitating a major crisis of care. These are not in themselves what we usually think of as capitalist crisis. We usually think it's an economic crisis, the stock market crashes, there's mass unemployment, and so on and so forth. That does happen periodically in capitalism. I'm not denying it. But our crisis today is not limited to the economy. It's a multi-sectoral crisis affecting many different sectors of social life all at once. It's what historians would call a general crisis of the whole social order. And if we want to understand that, we have to understand not just how the economy creates problems within its own sphere, how the principles according to which the economy operates create problems in its own sphere. We also have to understand the relationship between the economy and what I think of as its background conditions of possibility. So let me elaborate. You don't have a capitalist economy, or indeed any kind of economy, if you don't have a relatively stable natural order in which you can count on, having breathable air, drinkable water, a habitable climate, a relatively stable sea levels, and so on. You don't have a system of production without energy, without raw materials. And in order for that to be relatively stable over time, the system, the economy, can't stand in a very predatory relation to nature. So sustainable natural order is one essential background condition for a capitalist economy. I would say the same. I think many people understand that. That's not very controversial to say that today. What maybe some people don't understand is that a sustainable organization of what feminists call social reproduction is also necessary for the monetized form of life, the capitalist economy. We need to have families and communities with sufficient energy and skill and creativity to sustain human beings, to produce a new generation of workers for the economy, to replenish and restore on a daily basis the existing workers who have to be fed and bathed and rested and have a place, a home, and so on. So there's a tremendous amount of social reproductive activity that is not part of the official economy, but that is the absolutely essential basis for that economy. So that's a second necessary condition. Public powers, public goods, infrastructure, communications infrastructure, roads, bridges, physical infrastructure, health infrastructure, all of that. That's very important. And without that, the economy doesn't function. So we have to have public powers that are adequately funded and that are capable, that are not hollowed out by tax evasion and regulatory capture and all of that stuff. And so the real question for us is what's the relation between capitalism's economy and these absolutely essential background conditions? What's the relation between production and reproduction, between markets and states, between society and nature? And none of those questions appear on the radar screen if we think that capitalism is only an economy. Capitalism is the name for a whole social order that authorizes and licenses and even incentivizes economic actors to gobble up these essential background conditions without caring one iota about any responsibility to replenish what they take, to repair what they damage, and to maintain their own conditions of possibility. That's why I call it cannibal capitalism, because capitalism is bigger than an economy. It's a whole societal order.
In Europe, we have this political theorist, Thomas Hobbes. In Europe, we have this political theorist, Thomas Hobbes. I'm pretty sure you know the
Thomas
Leviathan.
Hobbes, in Europe, yeah.
I really like him because in political theory, he says the state is there for ensuring the secure and peaceful life of its citizens. So economy and capitalism is a part of that system, but not the only part. So the state has to make sure that its people are safe and living peacefully. The cannibal capitalism is a threat to that peaceful and secure living. So my question is, how is it possible, or how could the state allow cannibal capitalism to overtake it and every other aspect of its system?
Yeah, well, I would mention another European theorist, now a much later thinker of the 20th century, and that is Karl Polanyi, who the author of the magnificent masterpiece, really, called The Great Transformation. And he understands, and this is a little bit different from the other Karl Marx, and both of these guys are fantastic in my view.
I have a question for Karl Marx to you as well.
Yeah, but for Polanyi, the issue is he understands the whole sort of modern era from the early 19th century on to our time as a kind of struggle between people who want to just keep extending the market and create, they call it a free market. He thinks the idea of a free, self-regulated market is a contradiction in terms, that left to itself without any external regulation, the market becomes, he doesn't use the word, but in my terms, a cannibal. It just consumes all of society and tries to remake everything as part of the economy, tries to commodify everything, to marketize everything. So for Karl Polanyi, the whole history of the last couple of centuries is a struggle between those who are trying to extend the market and remove all limits from it, and those who are trying to put on the brakes and say, no, we have to draw some limits here. And that's a useful way for us to think about your question of why this is happening now. It's because we've had a transformation in the nature of capitalism from the social democratic form of capitalism in the immediate post-war period in Europe, post-World War II. In the United States, it started earlier with the New Deal. But this is a kind of form of capitalism that empowers national states to exercise more control over the economic system, to regulate it in a more active way, to draw some lines about how far the market can go and in what form it can operate. This was not a perfect system, this social democratic capitalism. It was still premised on women's dependency on a male wage. It was still premised within a country like the United States on a real racial hierarchy. A lot of the wealth that funded it was siphoned from what was then called the Third World, or we could call it the Global South today, through forms of colonialism and imperialism. And we now understand that a lot of the wealth was also siphoned from nature, because this was a form of capitalism that depended on the centrality of the internal combustion engine, right? It was the age of the automobile and all of the allied forms of industry. So it was not just the old carbon coal economy, but the refined oil economy. So there was a lot wrong with it. And I don't think we should now be thinking of going back to it. However, it did take seriously the problem of the limits of the market. It took seriously the idea that the market can't do everything, that it can't supply public goods, that it can't protect our social reproductive capacities, that it left to itself, it will devour states. So that was an element of realism, you could say. The transition to our current form of capitalism has changed everything. It's changed the game. The current form has been called neoliberalism. It's also been called financialized capitalism. Both these terms are useful. The main thing is that it was based on the idea that that there was the problems in society were due to too much government, red tape, et cetera, et cetera. Taxes were too high. The entrepreneurial creative spirit was being stifled by all the regulations. And so it was an idea that wanted to give much more latitude, much more scope to the free market. And it changed the so-called free market, I should say. So it changed the balance of power between states and corporations. Corporations became global mega corporations, which were too big and out of the jurisdiction for states. They couldn't be controlled. So this has brought the privatization of a great deal of public infrastructure, including public health infrastructure, which we saw, was so important for dealing with the pandemic. And the fact that it was much of it was in private hands has created enormous problems for public health. Many other examples I could give you. But in any case, in a sense, Karl Polanyi predicted all of this. He said that if we didn't get control over this runaway cannibalizing force, that we would see the whole bases of our lives being eaten up. And I think that prediction came true. So Hobbes was a great thinker, too, of a much earlier time, but no one better than Polanyi has sort of got the finger on the pulse of our problem today.
Yeah, and it sounds a lot like what I'm hearing now, because Germany has a budget discussion right now between the parties and the federal government. And to our dismay, the finance minister is from the liberals, from the FDP, and he's talking the same things. Lower taxes, less control for the firms, and getting migrants of the global south, because we have a demographic crisis actually at the moment. And he doesn't want to give money for those reproductional sectors in our country to get more workers.
Yes.
For childcare, for example.
Yeah.
So we have there big crisis, and his solution and the solution of politics in general at the moment is to get more migrants to fill up the lost workforce, and the women are not reproducing as much as in the last century, because we cannot afford it in any way. Not because we cannot afford it because we do not earn enough, and you cannot afford it because there's no one there for the childcare when women are at work.
No one has time.
Yes.
And we should add that but the way we still talk about women aren't there and so on, we still let men off the hook here too.
Yeah, of course. But as Eastern German, I have a family history where everyone was working. My mother and my father, my grandmother and my grandfather. So I cannot think about a family where are not both parents are working. So I need childcare.
Right. Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. We were talking.
And by the way, this idea of the there's now a thing that the sociologists talk about, the two-earner family, as if this is something new, whereas of course depending on where you're from and so on, that could be an old story, as it apparently is for you, and depending on what class you're in too, it would be an old story.
Working class
people didn't have the luxury, unless they were in highly skilled, specialized work with good unions. They didn't have the luxury of living on only one salary. So we speak today about the two-earner family, and that's the new ideal in the gender order. And that has supplanted the earlier ideal, which was strong in Germany and fairly strong in the United States, the so-called family wage. You pay the man in a high-paid manufacturing, unionized, secure job enough to support a whole family. That social democratic order was premised on this idea. Now, not everyone achieved it, but that was the ideal that everyone wanted. Today, that ideal has been delegitimated both by the feminist critique of women's dependency, which is completely justified, but also by the character of neoliberal labor markets, which pay too low wages that are too little and require many more hours of paid work per household, and not just because you have two parents that are both employed, but also because you have situations where even two parents with two jobs is not enough, and people are moonlighting and have lots of little jobs. They don't have one decent paying good job. So many more hours. And this is this issue of the sort of crisis of care is also a crisis of time.
Yeah.
We talk about time poverty. Too much of our time is being devoted to the labor market, so that all the other urgently important things in our lives, political participation, creative use of leisure, family and life and community life, neighborhood associations, there's no time for that. So we're really on a treadmill here and desperately trying to scramble to figure out how to cram all of this stuff into one day.
Yeah, I know I'm pretty privileged to have the time to do this podcast, because yes, I have a pretty secure job, which is paying really well because I'm working for the government.
Good. Good for you.
I'm living pretty well. My mother, on the other hand, is taking care of two of my grandparents right now, and this is only possible. Also, it is only possible for her to do this unpaid care job because she is not able to work in the normal workforce anymore, because she's not able, because of her health.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
So, time. So capitalism is eating
this
time.
This is all part of what to whom often people talk about neoliberalism without talking about the change in the gender order and in the family relation between family and the labor market. This is all part of neoliberalism. It's another example of why you can't talk about capitalism as just that economic system. You have to talk about the relation between the economic system and the family system and the gender order. perfect example
Yes,
of what we
yes,
were saying
and
before.
it's not anti-feminism to speak about the fact that women want to take their time with their children, especially after they are born. Yeah, we can talk about how it's more modern to divide that time between man and woman, but still I would like to have the time with my children. So that's not anti-feminism, even if the actual if the society today is telling me differently.
Right. I mean, the thing is, I think that there are different people have different desires and preferences in that respect, how long they want to be away from work and so on, and how much they want to share with a partner. And then, of course, there are all sorts of people who don't have partners and who are raising children and families on their own. So I think that the main thing that we would want is a social system that doesn't penalize people for their choices, that organizes the institutional patterns in such a way that you can do more than one thing at once, and that you can shift easily back and forth from at different stages of your life when it makes more sense for you to devote more time to this as opposed to that. The idea of, the lifelong housewife is probably not something that most people want. So anyway, the idea of being able to move back and forth, very important.
Freedom of choice.
You can call it that, except that the important thing is to emphasize that so much has to be in place for it to be a real choice.
Yes.
Right? That there are social and material preconditions for choice. We talk, especially in the United States, much too glibly about choice, as if it's all just within an individual's will. But these choices are often so stacked that they're not real choices.
I often hear the problem of our current system and the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of climate change can be solved by innovation in techniques. So I got you a short video clip of one of my beloved YouTube channels, Extra History, and there is a little history of the cotton gin and its innovation and what it meant for slavery and Black people in America. Maybe we could watch it together. It's really short, and then you can comment on it.
Great. What a nice idea.
Bowling Green Plantation, Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 1795. Lala, a slave woman, hasn't seen her husband all day. Worried, she quietly looks for him until she hears a noise coming from a nearby barn. She finds her husband Jimmy dripping in sweat, hard at work on a large machine. He says their master wants another cotton gin, and that another machine will help make things easier for the other slaves. More cotton gins, he explains, meant white folks might even eventually free their slaves. At this, Lala admits she can't fathom how this was going to help free them. If more machines could process more cotton per day, wouldn't the white people just want more cotton picked? Jimmy dismisses his wife's concerns and rushes her out of the barn, and she goes to bed alone. But sleep doesn't come, because her gut tells her that her husband is wrong.
Okay, I'm just going to get the screen back to you. Right. Interesting.
So is capitalism, especially cannibal capitalism, and its problems solved by innovation?
Okay. Look, I mean, there's a lot to say about that video. And so he's saying 1795. I don't think, I'm not sure who made that. I don't think that the timing is right. I don't think there were cotton gins in Mississippi in 1795. And in fact, most planters had their cotton processed not by slaves, but offsite by so-called free workers. So anyway, there might be some inaccuracies or misleading features of that particular video. But the question you're raising is an important question about technology. There's something, just to first think about it from an ecological point of view. There is something called Jevons paradox. The idea that when you make a sophisticated technological process possible in a way that is supposed to save labor, what actually happens is that you increase the demand for the item in question. And this is what that little video is saying.
I'm sorry for the maybe incorrect facts, but
yes,
the point got along.
Yeah. So, and there are lots of examples historically about this. In fact, I just this morning heard on the radio, I was listening to BBC, and they were interviewing a guy about the new technologies of carbon capture. And there's apparently, I don't follow this very closely, but apparently there's been something that looks like a breakthrough. It's not, it's perfect, but some advance in the technology of carbon capture that allows more efficient capture, and with some ideas about what to do with the stuff when you capture it that might work better than trying to fill disused coal mines and oil wells with the stuff, which is problematic. So, but the guy, so the interviewer asked this expert, well, so will this, really help us in terms of the current greenhouse gas problem? And the guy says, well, there are two ways to look at it. You can say it's great, we get more of this carbon out of the air, but then you could also get the reaction, well, okay, as long as we know how to get it out, there's no reason to stop putting it in. So let's just keep going with fossil fuels, spew out more greenhouse gases, and then we can take them back. So this is a completely perverse response, right? Whereas if there's any use for carbon capture technology, and assuming it's not going to have very dangerous unintended effects that we can't quite imagine or predict now, if there's any reason to do it, it's only as a very short-term transitional thing while we are defossilizing. But it could create the perverse incentive not to defossilize. Now, and this is all connected to the profit motive. This gives the fossil fuel companies, a license in a sense to avoid the huge expense of shifting their whole basis of operations, or even of going out of business altogether. Which brings us back to the sort of what drives the whole thing, which is right the need to, the imperative in a capitalist system to accumulate more capital, and for the firms involved, that means primarily profit. Okay.
I think a lot of politicians and entrepreneurs are hoping for such a technology because it takes away the incentive to change.
Right.
Yeah. So they can tell the public as well. And human nature is like that. You don't need to change. Yeah.
Right.
We can keep on living on this planet and it has no limits, which is not true. Even with such a technology, this planet has ending resources, even for oil and gas. So someday it will be gone.
Right. And in the meantime, God knows what else will be gone. Yes, right. in terms of habitability. Yes.
So let's come back to my original questions.
Yeah.
You write about the crisis of social reproduction. Can capitalism, especially in the form of neoliberalism, even survive without care labor? Because we had yesterday the International Women's Day. What would have happened if 50% of the workforce would just stop working? Even the free labor works.
Right. Yes. And I don't know if there was a women's strike in Germany this year, in the US.
We just have normal strikes in the childcare sector because it's governmental run, and there are at the moment wage discussions.
Yeah. All I want to say is that in Latin America, in some countries in Southern Europe, and in lots of places, before the pandemic, 3 years or so ago, there were big women's strikes on March 8th, and this meant this was a way of sort of calling attention to what do we mean by a strike and what do we mean by work in a capitalist society. Typically, that means the organized paid workers in a firm who are agitating for higher pay or shorter hours or whatever. But the women's strike said that's not the only kind of work, and that's not the only meaning of a strike. We can also strike in relation to social reproductive work that is not part of the wage sector. We can also call attention to this work and show how important, how indispensable, essential it is to society by a brief stoppage. And there were all kinds of aspects to these women's strikes, including the idea that women should stop smiling. That the society depends too much on our kind of femininity to keep the social cooperation oiled, so to speak. Anyway, that was an attempt to take a holiday, International Women's Day, that had sort of degenerated into send your secretary a bouquet of flowers. Right.
I got alcohol and chocolate.
Right. So in order to kind of take something that had become ceremonial and repoliticize it and connect it with the whole crisis of social reproduction. I think the best way to mark International Women's Day is to make visible social reproduction, the absolutely necessary work, the forms of social activity and caregiving that capitalism in the narrow sense, or that the capitalist firms cannibalize, that they free ride on, that they depend on, but refuse to in any way support or pay for or replenish.
Yeah, it may be an international holiday, but there are just two countries two federal countries in Germany, which allow a day of work. Yeah,
right.
But it's for everyone, not just women. So maybe we should go back to the strike model, or maybe we should have a holiday only for women, so that everyone sees what happens if 50% of the workforce are gone.
Right. Interesting.
How is capitalism connected to the political crisis and democracy right now?
Yeah. I think there are two different levels. That's a very fundamental question. I think it's deeply connected to the political crisis, the crisis of democracy. I think there are two levels. First of all, there's the level of governance, problem solving. Are states at every level, from cities to provinces to national, federal governments, and so on, do the public powers actually have the capacity and the will to solve people's problems, to identify them and fix them? And I would say that governments at all levels have lost a lot of that problem-solving capacity because of this shift to neoliberalism. We have corporations that don't pay taxes. Apple pays hardly any taxes at all. They have their funds are parked in offshore tax havens. They find all sorts of clever ways to juggle their books and to evade taxes. So the tax burden falls more on working people who do not have the ability to evade these taxes. Now, that creates two problems. First of all, a revenue shortage, which various political forces on the right use as an excuse to say we have to cut social spending. We can't afford it. Of course, they don't say that about military spending and so on, but all right. Now, so we really have less capacity. And I mentioned the pandemic before, and that was a great example because most states had disinvested from the public health infrastructure and suddenly found themselves without ventilators, without vaccine storage capacity, without research capacity. They had to turn to the private sector to make vaccines. Then the private sector insisted on patenting them, and now we have all these problems with the intellectual property in vital health-saving resources that should be in the public domain, but are now patented by private corporations. So this is just one example of losing the capability that you need to solve problems. And I think in general we have large corporations capture the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be regulating them. Who sits on these boards, on these committees? Executives who have taken a leave from their private companies and gone into the public for a while and then come back. So it's, again, self-regulation, which is ridiculous. Okay, so that's the problem on the level of governance. Our public powers do not have the capacity, even if they wanted to solve a lot of our problems. Now, there's another level, and that is the level of legitimacy, or you could use this Gramscian word, hegemony, meaning that a lot of people are disgusted with government now. They are they see that government does not solve their problems, and they are looking for radical alternatives, looking outside the box. And we have some better ideas that come from the left, and a lot of very bad ideas that come from the extreme authoritarian, racist, populist right. I know a little bit about how that looks in your country. I know a lot more about how it looks in my country with Trumpism and MAGA and all the
side effects.
QAnon conspiracies, election denialism, climate denialism, vaccine denialism, all of this kind of stuff. So we've got a crisis of governance, but also a crisis of hegemony. And that sends people into chaotic. They don't believe the official common sense anymore. They don't trust experts. They don't trust government. And in some cases, for very good reason. I'm not saying that they should trust, but they go off the deep end in some cases and don't believe in science and don't believe in, in rationality at all. So that's we've got gridlock, we've got polarization, which only exacerbates the crisis of governance. In the United States, the Congress, we have now a split government between the parties with deep polarization. So no so-called bipartisan cooperation. So nothing gets done. No legislation. of any significance can pass today, with the Republicans controlling the House, the Democrats controlling Congress. In both cases, very slim margins. So that's just the U.S. situation. Things like this are going on everywhere. And the result is a kind of paralysis. And that just gives much more wiggle room, much more latitude to big capital, to big corporate powers, which, by the way, have zero loyalty to any one country. Their country is the globe. And that's another issue, because states are territorial. Capital is free to cross borders. And we don't have public powers that are at the scale that the private powers are at. We don't have a global climate, a public climate regime that could actually take and implement and enforce decisions, even if they could agree on them, which they can't. We don't have global public health agencies that have real power to deal with things. We are, constantly, again, deferring to the corporations. So, all of that suggests that I would say that in general, there's a problem in the modern capitalist world, because we have a global economy and we still have national states. So there's a mismatch between the political capacities and the economic forces that need to be regulated and controlled. That's always the case in modern capitalism, but it becomes especially severe in neoliberal capitalism, because, as I said earlier, the whole balance of power between global markets and global corporations and global investors on the one side, and public capacities to regulate on the other, that's completely out of whack in a much more severe and extreme way now.
So do you think the problem is that capitalism can use the whole world, while democracies of a nation state cannot control them? So we need global institutions to solve this problem?
Well, we need a completely different relationship between what we think of as the private sector and the public powers, a completely different relationship. For example, it's not just that the problem of the mismatch between the national and the global. There's another even deeper and harder problem. And that is because our social system is based on the fiction that corporations and investors create profit and therefore have a right to appropriate it as their private property, which is not true for all the reasons we've been talking about. How much background time and effort the larger population contributes and gets nothing. So the idea that it somehow belongs to them is problematic. But the even deeper issue is that what sets the path, the trajectory, the pattern of societal development are their investment decisions. They take those huge profits and reinvest them in whatever way they think will give them even more profits, because that's their raison d'etre, to keep the share prices up and so on. So they're motivated by a private concern for their share prices and for their profit margins. And yet, the amount of capital that they dispose of is so enormous that their investment decisions dictate the whole shape of development. What kind of energy we use, what we are producing, where, by whom, how it's distributed, how it's transported, all of this stuff. They are dictating our relation to nature. They are dictating the relationship between populations in different parts of the globe, right? The relation between the global north and the global south. More than anything, they decide what that relation will look like because of these investment decisions. They decide what our family lives will be like, how much time we have or don't have for all that stuff. These things are set by economic actors focused on their bottom line, on private wealth accumulation. Now, that's a recipe for disaster. These should be public issues, what our relation to nature is going to be, how we're going to organize the relation between production and family life, between what we make to be sold and what we do that is not going to be bought and sold. All of those should be big public questions, but they're taken off the political agenda and, in a sense, outsourced to the corporate sector. That's the biggest problem in the relationship between what we call states, but I would like to refer to public power more generally, and the private power of investors and corporations.
Can I bring an example to you for this? Because at the moment we have this war in Ukraine. So I heard a lot in the media that we miscalculated, because I'm part of the we, that capitalism brings democracy, or as politicians told me in the past, change through trade, Wandel durch Handel. And now we see democracy needs positive effects of capitalism to stay stable, to stay stable.
Yes.
Otherwise, if economies tank, we have a crisis.
Yes.
In democracy, in society, but you can also see capitalism does not need democracy.
Right.
It needs a strong state. So capitalism functions really good in Russia or China without democratic institutions. So right. I think it's really interesting that we are talking about the miscalculations about those countries like China and Russia in the terms of we miscalculated that trade will change them, while we in the West miscalculated the power of capitalism because capitalism wanted to tell that story.
Yeah. Well, the imperative to accumulate capital is certainly built into capitalism. And again, we're sort of back to that Polanyi story again. What a powerful force that is. It's not just individual greed. It's an institutionalized set of incentives that are very, very powerful, and so powerful that there are times when the people who are central actors in that profit system are willing to make their peace with the devil of any kind, because there's nothing worse than slowing down accumulation. And if you have to put up with some bad political stuff, well, so be it. That's exactly true. But I also want to say, since you mentioned the war in Ukraine, first of all, we can talk about the arms industry. That's extremely important.
We would be here another hour.
Yeah, how big a role that plays in the development of the military-industrial complex in various countries, and especially, of course, in the United States. And the other thing is, part of the present crisis of capitalism is a geopolitical crisis. In every phase of capitalist development, the system has always depended on one leading power to organize the international space in such a way that business can flourish. And in order to do that, the leading power has to be able to win the cooperation of allies and to put together a coalition that is big enough and strong enough to attract client states and so on. And it has to do this not only by force, but by exerting some kind of persuasive moral authority that we're not just out for our own national self-interest. We're not going to rip you off. We're going to do it for the common good, for the quote unquote free world or whatever, right? Some sort of idea. And until recently, it's been very clear that the United States played that role of the leading power. But it is a power in decline at the moment. It is not a rising economic power. China is the rising economic power in the world. And so the question is, how is the United States going to respond to that? Are they going to gin up a lot of anti-Chinese antagonism, which sometimes sounds like a prelude to war? Are they going to try to take Taiwan or something? Are we going to be plunged back into a much bigger war? It's not clear that the United States has much moral authority left after. Well, we could go back to Vietnam War. We could go back to the lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which destabilized the whole Gulf and Middle East. And
should I tell you a story about that? I was 16 when I saw Colin Powell tell that on live TV.
Yeah.
And I thought, this man is telling the biggest lie I've heard in my life. And
well, you were very smart to know that. A lot of people didn't know it until a little later.
That was just insane. What he was telling was insane.
Yeah. In any case, the last point about Iraq and so on is the origin of the refugee crisis that you are facing in Germany and Europe. We didn't have those people coming to us. They got dumped onto you. And the same with Afghanistan, another debacle for the United States. So I think that the U.S. moral authority is shaky at the moment. Its economic power is definitely challenged. It still has the military power, but is that really enough? So I think we're in for a rocky period at the geopolitical level. It's another aspect of the crisis. And I would say that the Ukraine war is, in reality, a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia over the bodies of Ukrainians who are caught in the middle. But there's a whole way in which the U.S. has been trying for a long time to weaken Russia, because it's a potential ally of China. And this is the level at which they play war games, trying to weaken Russia, has been baiting Russia, has been, pushing up ever closer, expanding NATO, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot of provocation for the U.S. side, none of which excuses Vladimir Putin, of course, but that there's a bigger story. It's not just Russia and Ukraine. There's a much bigger story. A battle for global hegemony is going on, and that is part of the crisis of capitalism today.
I don't know how much time you have left, because I have still questions.
One more question. Okay.
One more. I have follower questions a lot. So I will keep it short.
Okay.
So maybe my last question.
Okay.
So we talked a lot about cannibal capitalism. What would you suggest how to solve this crisis?
Well, I I mean, here I want to sort of say that the whole reasoning that informs my book is sort of an argument for a new social system, a non-capitalist alternative. Historically, the word for that has been socialism. That may not be a word that in many European countries has a good sound to it. Interestingly, in the United States, which hadn't had a socialist party for more than 50 years, that word is starting to sound good to a lot of young people. That's kind of interesting because it's not tainted with the SPD or whatever other forces have used the term. Anyway, I for myself am happy with the word democratic socialism, but I'm not I don't want to be sectarian and insist on it either. I think what we want is a system that does not set the economy up as a cannibal in relation to the rest of society. So I would say that a socialist society, if that's what we want to call it, is not only one that reorganizes production. It has to do something more fundamental. It has to reinvent the relation between production and reproduction, between the economy and public power, between the economic production and nature. We have to reimagine in a very radical way, right? These fundamental relations. It's not just about reorganizing the internal character of the economy, but the whole role it plays in relation to these other institutions. And for me, the crucial thing is, you could say, pay as you go, no free riding, meaning if you're going to take natural resources and start depleting them, you pay for their replenishment. If you damage anything, you pay to repair it. If you're going to siphon energies from people's daily, family, and community-oriented activities, caring activities, you take responsibility to ensure that those energies are replenished and that any damage that is done to them is repaired. That is the sine qua non of stopping cannibalization. No more siphoning wealth from outside the economy in order to keep the profits up. And then what I said before, I think the heart and soul of what I would understand by socialism is public control over the surplus. If we actually produce a surplus, and that may be a question if we even want to or do, if we do that, we control it. It's a public matter how it is used to shape the future. That doesn't stay in the hands of private accumulators, of profiteers. That fundamental power to shape the direction of society.
Yeah, I agree. Companies get a lot of free rides, especially in Texas, and they do not pull their weight in society and our system. So a few follow-up questions, and then I let you go.
Well, I'm afraid make it one only, and please
one only.
Okay. Yes, it's. We've been talking for an hour. We've been talking for an hour.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's such a good talk. Good. I'm taking the question of Bernhard. What has capitalism ever done for us?
Well, it's not particularly an answer, a question I feel I can answer because, it's a counterfactual. What would we have done otherwise? And we can't know the answer to that. I don't believe that it would be right to say that capitalism has brought us science or something like that. I think we could have had science without it. I don't think capitalism deserves the credit for that. And so it's not a question I find meaningful.
That's okay too. I have no time left with you and the other questions. So I thank you very much for your time. Took too much time as well.
No, it's okay. Take care and thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.